I think a lot of times we intellectualize our grief and we try to justify and just think our way through it. But grief is a hard thing. And the workbook allows you to reflect and explore what's going on in your heart and answering the questions and taking it chapter by chapter. It guides you through that process in a kind, generous way for you to just give yourself permission to actually take the exploration and to set that time aside that we don't normally, and society doesn't normally allow us to do.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to The Successful Bookkeeper. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a wonderful one. At one point or another, we've all suffered a loss in our lives, whether it was a loved one, a friendship, or even a business situation that went sour and took away something dear to you. Today's guest is a grief recovery specialist who focuses on helping people heal and thrive again. Cheryl Parker, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Michael. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's wonderful to have you, and I've been looking forward to having you on the show for some time now, based on everything that's been happening in the world, and not that loss only happens in COVID-19, but it certainly brings it forward for many people. Not only our listeners, but many of their people that they're involved with, business owners that they're involved with, their family, friends, acquaintances, that sort of thing. So I think it'll be a wonderful episode to address this and give people information and pathways to help deal with that in their lives. But before we get into all of that, Cheryl, please tell us your story and why it's important to you to help others heal from grief.
Yeah, absolutely. So I got very interested in grief with an unfortunate trauma that I experienced. My 8-year-old daughter, Rachel, died in 1998, and I was thrown into a grief process. And fortunately for me, I had an outlet that kind of took a life of its own. Rachel had actually expressed 5 weeks before she got sick that she wanted to donate her organs to help save kids when she died. And that came about from me reading a newspaper article in the Sunday Sun about a little boy who had just undergone a double lung transplant. And she asked some questions, and I told her about organ transplant. And she just embraced that as wanting to do that when she died. And then fast forward 5 weeks, she ended up with complications from a flu virus. She got rushed to Sick Kids Hospital, and they found that she had a bleed in her brain that was a complication from a condition called ITP, where your antibodies attack your platelets instead of the virus. So they performed brain surgery on Rachel to try to release the pressure from the bleed in her brain, but her brain was too swollen and they couldn't save her, and she was pronounced brain dead. So that actually made her a candidate for organ donation. And they asked me if I had considered organ donation, and I said no, but she had, and they were shocked, and I told them the story. And so, in our grieving process, we, said goodbye to Rachel. And like I said, I was thrown into this grief process, and I got involved with organ donation. And through that process of doing a lot of public speaking, some interviews on radio, TV, documentaries, and whatnot, I found that there was a lot of miscommunication around grief and a lot of lack of information around grief. And I just knew during that time period that I wanted to get through my grief process and be able to speak some education into how to grieve. Now, I wasn't in the position at the time to do it because I was going through my own grief process. But I learned so much during that process that I knew that I wanted to bring this education because I thought I can't be the only one that doesn't have access to this information. Now, we've come a long way in 20 years, but I still think that there's a lot of education needed in this area, not only how we grieve ourselves and how to manage that in society these days, but also how to support others when they're grieving. Because if we're not experiencing it, we'll probably have someone in our life that's experiencing it. So that's how it came about. And I just got really interested in this emotion of grief and learned some huge valuable lessons that I wanted to share with everybody.
It's an incredible story. And I'm sitting listening to that story, and it's brings me near tears thinking about it, the journey that you've went through and so many go through. And I guess for myself, I put it into my own thought of, my children, my family, and, it can be heavy. It can be heavy.
Yes.
And no doubt, it's bringing up past loss for myself, I would imagine, right? Losing my father and,
right.
Different things like that. And I think that's maybe part of, in our society, we haven't maybe dealt with it when it's been necessary to deal with it or whatever the case may be. Or it's just the way that I am. I get moved by these things and I have deep compassion for people going through these situations. But this also led you to write a book. Tell us a little bit about the book that you wrote.
Absolutely. So I started working with clients and guiding them through their grief process. And I wanted to be able to reach more people. And I wanted to be able to document and get this education into as many hands as I could. So I just took all the lessons and all the pitfalls and all the strategies that I used along my journey, and I wrote a workbook. And I wrote it in an analogy of walking through a forest. And I named chapters like the log on the path, because it's not always just, walking merrily down the path of grief. It's like there's going to be logs in the path. There's going to be obstacles that you're going to have to face during your journey. I wrote one chapter is called The Swamp. And that's like, when you're really trudging through the tough stuff in your grief journey, and the meadow, when you actually start to see the light. I have one chapter in there called The Waterfalls. So, waterfalls can appear beautiful and sound lovely, and you can be having those good days and you can have experienced the good, but also a waterfall can be relentless and can be smashing against the rocks and leave you just feeling helpless. So just the yin and the yang of the process, and just showing how you can have a good day and then be thrown into a dark day, and just the dancing through that whole process. So the analogies just made sense to me, and my clients just seem to embrace that whole analogy and explain how they're feeling, so they kind of have a framework for it. I know that there's commonly the steps of grief that people go through, and quite often it's misunderstood that it's, grief is not linear. It's not like you're going to go through all the steps of grief in a nice, neat package. It can be messy, and it's a whole journey. So that's where the path came in, and it's I've got rest stops throughout the workbook where I ask you questions, and it's an exploration. It's really an exploration from your head to your heart, because I think a lot of times we intellectualize our grief and we try to justify and just think our way through it. But grief is a heart thing, And the workbook allows you to reflect and explore what's going on in your heart and answering the questions and taking it chapter by chapter. It guides you through that process in a kind, generous way for you to just give yourself permission to actually take the exploration and to set that time aside that we don't normally, and society doesn't normally allow us to do.
It was a book that I sent to my mother when I learned about the book, and my father died in 2015. They were separated for years, but this was her childhood romance, high school. They met in high school, and they were married for close to 30 years before they separated, and do 2 children together, and there's still an incredible bond. But then about a year and a half later, she lost her partner to cancer as well. And so, my mom's very open. I sent her the book, and she got this book. I don't even think I told her I was sending her the book. I just sent it, and she read the book. Like, many people get books, they never read the books. She opened, obviously it was the right time for her. She read the book, didn't tell me she was reading the book, but she went through it, and then she called me and she said, "My goodness, that book was so amazing." And what she had told me was interesting is that she said going through the process, she gained a new view of grief in her life. And she didn't realize there were so many, like the big ones are, you lost your former partner, you lost your partner in life, your mother, your father, these big ones. But it's the dog that she lost when she was a child, that was still grief there that was going on for her. And she really felt like being able to address it now in her life, and the small stones, but the other big stones of losing partners and family members, it released something for her that gave her new sense of freedom. My mother is, in her 70s, and she did this last year, and it created freedom. Now, my mother started traveling, doing things that she wouldn't have probably done before. She was on her own. Obviously, she's a widow, but she was going. She drove all the way from Arizona to British Columbia by herself. Like, she just rebirthed herself in a way as she became more who she really is through dealing with these grief moments in her life that she didn't even know she had. And I mean, I'm really grateful that you wrote this book, because it's really changed her life. And she's, even through COVID, she's been able to embrace being secluded by herself, sheltering at home. And she does all sorts of wonderful things every day. She's back into sewing. She's doing crafts. She's making all sorts of canning and cooking for people that can't cook. Like, she's gotten a whole new lease on life as a result of dealing with grief that she didn't even know that she had.
Yeah, I love hearing stories like that. And that was the biggest lesson I got when I was going through my grief journey, was I wasn't just grieving the loss of my daughter. Not like that wouldn't be big enough, but I saw this trail of losses behind me that I had never, ever dealt with. I didn't even categorize them as grief, because like you say, most people associate it with the big losses, the deaths, but we're dealing with losses all the time. And like you've made reference to a couple of times with the COVID, people are experiencing a loss of connection, loss of, their exercise regime, loss of their, jobs, loss, so many different losses that aren't associated with death that we just kind of, like I said, intellectualize and keep trudging forward. But for her to look back and see that the small losses that accumulate and get you to, bring you to where you are, And it was resolving all those other losses that frees you up for the big, say, whatever, whoever categorizes the big losses, I say in quotes. But yeah, it really is that examination of your life that the book allows you to do.
And I would think too, one of the areas that our listeners, they work with business owners, and in business, there's always loss. There's gains and losses, big and small, and so we're also going through our own grief journey, but we're interacting and having relationships with other people that are often, almost certainly, going through their own grief journey. And we don't often think about that. If someone's going through grief and they're in our life, that has an impact on us. What do you see around that, or what have you noticed around that?
I absolutely see that. I had a friend who was dealing with their mental health, and I was like tripping over myself trying to support her. And I found that it was starting to affect my mental health by trying to be there for her and her not being open to me supporting her. And at some point, I had to actually step back and take care of myself rather than impacting my own mental health to try to help somebody else. So, it's one thing to be empathetic and to support others, but to know where to set the boundaries and where to take care of your own health in some situations. But also just having the education on knowing how to support somebody and what it could look like for different people. And I tell people to not assume that you know what that other person needs, but to ask questions about how support could look like for them and whether or not you can provide that to them. So everybody's kind of taking care of themselves, because if you're grieving and somebody else is grieving, it's like it can get kind of entangled and can start to impact your own mental health.
It's great advice and something that impacts us all the time, whether people are, I find in today's, well, it's always been that way, but as I age, I guess looking at it from my perspective, as I age, friends losing mothers and fathers, I've lost my father, it's often difficult sometimes to know what it is that they need, as you say, how do you help somebody that's faced with their family member who's got cancer or some illness, or they've lost somebody? It can be a feeling of helplessness.
Absolutely. And no two people grieve the same. Even two people in the same family with the same loss will not grieve the same. So, for your example, losing your dad, it's like your siblings won't grieve the same way that you do because it's a different relationship. It's your life experiences, your belief systems, all of that plays into how you grieve. And so, again, I just implore people to not assume that we know what people are going through and what they need. Because, like I say, no two people grieve the same.
Now, in terms of dealing with grief and going through the grief journey, I mean, there's obviously, as I've shared about my mother's situation, it wasn't easy for her to go through the book. She was maybe ready at the time, but going through grief, it brings things up, and often it can be something that, this is difficult. It can be uncomfortable. It can take you places that you don't want to go, but yet to go there is a benefit. There is the living. We are alive. We have the opportunity to make the most of our days, the most of our lives, and that it has an impact then back to our relationships and people that we're around. Because if we're living in joy, we bring joy to the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. And you and I were discussing recently about how if we don't, tackle the grief for those who have left us, then it's impacting the ones who we are still living with.
That is exactly right. I don't know where I heard it, and I'm probably not going to do it justice, but the saying was, what we keep in kills us, and what we release frees us. Or brings us brings us life, something like that.
So many times people that I've worked with hang on to their loved one because they think that it keeps them closer to their loved one. And I get that feeling because I experienced that for the first couple of years after losing Rachel. It's like I wanted to keep that connection. I actually wanted to marry that pain because it kept me attached to her. And what I didn't know, and you can't possibly know until you take the journey, is that in hindsight, I realized that actually letting go of that pain had me be closer to her. And it doesn't make sense, but that is what happened. And so, working through your grief with somebody that can actually, hold your hand through the process and assure you that letting go that you so painfully want to hang on to will actually bring you joy and will bring you closer to your loved one. It sounds counterintuitive, but it really is, the way to your heart and the way to open up your heart and feel closer to your loved one.
It's wonderful experience from what you've dealt with, and to share that back with our listener. And what I'm hoping for our listener is that I know for sure many listeners are dealing with grief, and somewhere along their grief journey. And if our listener can return to joy, it will bring more to this life, more to their business, more to their families, and give them renewed energy. I mean, grief has a cost, and we need to go through it. But there is a cost, and it can be very draining. It can alter the way we see the world, and what we bring to the world every day when we awake. And so going on this journey can be very beneficial to ourselves and as well the people around us. What are some steps that people can take to even consider moving forward in their grief journey?
Well, I think that, the first thing is the awareness that it's costing them something and wanting to release that pain. And, knowing that grief never ends, but that you can actually, get complete with the pain and move forward. So I guess the awareness of that. I know that not everybody is ready to sit down and work with somebody or even work through a workbook, but I created the 7 stepping stones to reclaiming your life after loss with people in mind who just kind of wanted to dip their toe into it and just see, well, what would this look like? Or, maybe let's just try this on. So I wanted to provide a free resource just to give somebody a taste of it, to just take a glimpse of what's possible. So I created the 7 stepping stones for that purpose. And then I guess people can, go through that and then see if it is something that they actually wanted to take on and take to the next step.
Tell us a little bit about the 7 stepping stones to reclaiming life after loss.
Yeah, so first thing is just identifying the losses, and like you said, like identifying that those old losses, like your mom experienced with pets, and all the things we experience through life, and just kind of getting a whole context of your life and loss, and seeing who you are around loss, and then just exploring for yourself what that means for you. And then noticing the impacts that it has on your life, and the next step is respond. Like, how are you responding to your grief? What behaviors is this causing? And then taking that leap of opening up your heart and being willing to actually let go. And then allowing grief to change you. Because I know for me, when Rachel died, it was like I had this picture of this broken glass or this broken mirror on the ground and all these shattered pieces. And all I wanted to do was take all those pieces and put it back together. I just wanted to be who I was before Rachel died. And realizing that was impossible left me feeling so hopeless. But the gift was that it wasn't about putting all those shard pieces of glass or mirror back together. It was about who was I going to become from the journey. And, I welcomed, after the fact, throwing all those glass pieces aside and becoming, who I was going to be. And it's like allowing that grief to change you and become something else. And then the last stepping stone is recreating, which is recreating who you are, just like you're describing your mom. Now she's cooking and she's sewing and she's traveling. It's like she has literally recreated herself. And I worked with this other woman who was extremely depressed after her husband died, and she couldn't work. She, was a supervisor at her work. She had 13 staff. She couldn't make decisions. She couldn't concentrate. She left her work, and she just didn't even want to carry on her life without her husband. She was only 57 years old, and for her life was over. And after working with me and going through the 8 weeks of My Good Grief, she quit her job. She sold her house. She moved to Ottawa, and she took art classes. Because through this process, she realized that she had had a dream unfulfilled because her dad squashed it when she was 19 years old. And so she erected this dream of hers and went to art school in Ottawa. And she's in a new relationship and she's just thriving in her life. So, recreating yourself is just such a beautiful process to come out the other side.
That's so beautiful. Our listeners are business people. They're bookkeepers and running bookkeeping businesses and doing bookkeeping for businesses. And sometimes the best thing we can do for our business is to take care of ourselves and be in the best emotional, mental, spiritual shape that we possibly can, because then we can be leaders in our life, leaders in our business. Mm-hmm. And so this has been a tremendous episode, I think, to have people take a look at some things that maybe don't often come up in a business conversation or in a situation where let's talk about grief or address that we might have grief, because it is heavy and it is something that in this society, in our Western society, that we often push down and hope to have go away, and that we just all live forever. Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
And yet by doing that, we end up missing out on life and missing out on the gift of life that's been given to us. And so, Cheryl, I really want to thank you for coming on the show and sharing your story and for the work that you do. And the difference that you're making for people like my mom.
Oh, you're so welcome. Yeah, and I know it is a heavy topic, and I really don't want it to be about doom and gloom. I want it to be about recreation and bringing joy to life and just kind of normalizing the conversation, because we all experience it. But you're right, it's not a common conversation. It's not one that comes up in the business world very often. So yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes. Well, with leaders like you out there changing that conversation, bringing it, it's much needed, not only in our industry, but every industry and every business and social setting is taking care of people and making sure they're healthy and have what they need. So we do that, and it's change, and it makes a difference. So that's great. Now, what is the best way for people to learn more about you and to get access to the 7 stepping stones and perhaps your book?
Yeah, sure. So it's all accessible at my website, www.cheryls, mygoodgrief.com. And the book is can be ordered through the website, or you can access it on Amazon.ca or Amazon.com or the European Amazon sites.
Wonderful. We'll of course have a link to the 7 stepping stones. We'll have a link to the book, and we'll have a link to your website, Cheryl. And
super.
And again, I really appreciate you coming on the show, and I wish for all our listeners to embrace their own personal joy in their life and get as close as possible to it.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you. And with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.